Samuel chapter 17, the story of David and Goliath. And as you're turning there, Lee, would you mind getting my cup of water? I left it on the table in the back. I would greatly appreciate that. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Every Sunday school class, every child that's been raised in a Christian family or a Christian church has heard the story of David and Goliath. It is one of the most well-known Bible stories of all time. Thank you very much. But one thing I want you to understand as we study this chapter is that David had never read the chapter. I mean, what David did in this chapter, he did not know the outcome. We read the story and we say, what a wonderful Bible story. But David didn't know that. And J. Vernon McGee entitles this chapter, David's Training Ground. And you remember in our study last time that Samuel the prophet had anointed David as the next king of Israel. The ancient rabbis, the tradition was that David was about 10 years old, and at that anointing, Samuel whispered in David's ear, "You're the next king of Israel." We don't know if that's true or not, but he did not get to the throne for the next 20 years. And in a lot of those years, he was a shepherd out in the pastures watching the sheep. He was a minister to Saul, and then he was a fugitive from Saul before he ever became the king on the throne. Now, we're not going to explore this tonight, but it's a great Bible study to do it. There are so many parallels between the life of David and David's eternal son, Jesus. Because we know, we just sang about it a minute ago, that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Is he sitting on his throne in Jerusalem today? No. But just like David wasn't, but will, so our David, Jesus, who's not on the throne today, will eventually be on the throne, and there is a usurper on the throne today. Just as there was in the days of David. King Saul was not the rightful king, but he tried to be the king. Satan is a defeated foe, but he still tries to be king until the time that he is done away with and the rightful king. So many parallels between the life of David and David's future son, Jesus. But we get into chapter 17, and there's some amazing lessons of faith and lessons of trust, but other things. And one of the things I'm just going to tell you at the beginning, having been thinking about this chapter all week and just the things that God wants to share with us. I've been sharing with my family. I've been venturing out a little bit from the church. While I'm here on usually Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I've been putting on my walking shoes. I went to Starbucks. I didn't buy anything. I just walked to Starbucks. I want to see how long it took me to get there. And today I went to Walmart. Opposite direction. See how long it took me to get to Walmart. I told Angela tonight in the car, I said, my next venture out, I'm going to walk to Zesto's and see how long that takes. I'm not buying anything. I'm just walking. But in the walking, today particularly, I was thinking about this psalm. This passage and what the Lord really wanted to show us out of this chapter. And what kept being impressed on me, and we'll find this later on in this chapter, is that we will never do anything in public for the honor of God that we don't do in private when nobody's watching. We will never do anything publicly for the honor of God if we're not doing something for the honor of God privately when nobody notices and nobody's paying attention and we have every opportunity to get involved in every other thing? That's when the real growth begins to go. And that's why I don't want us to begrudge any time that we spend alone with God. You know, we have a tendency as we compare ourselves with other people and other things to look at where they are and what's going on. And really what God is saying, I have got you planted just where you are, so bloom where you're planted. Learn to give God honor and glory and praise and submission in the quiet moments of your training. And just like J. Vernon McGee says that this chapter is the chapter of David's training, where God has you and me now is the chapter of our training. And as we start this chapter, David had no idea how this chapter would end. And you and I, in the chapter that we're in today, have no idea how it will end. And so what we need to do is keep our eyes on the Lord. And so we're going to go through this story tonight and bring out some points in here that hopefully will encourage you and me to be godly and righteous in our private moments, so when the time comes for God to do his work in us and through us, we have been prepared. David, we'll read later, was ready to face the giant because in the days of his shepherding, he had learned to worship. He had learned to protect the sheep. He had learned how to use a sling. He had learned to be a good marksman with a stone. And all those days of preparation, God was using for the time that David would publicly honor God. So in chapter 17, verse 1, the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Sokah, which belongs to Judah. And they encamped between Sokah and Azekah in Ephes Dammon. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they were encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up battle in array against the Philistines. The valley of Elah is a valley that is separated by a small brook that usually is dried up unless it's the rainy season. And a lot like it is here, when it rains after having not rained for a long time, we get these flash floods. Well, imagine in Israel, where they only get like 20 inches of rain a year, and they get a downpour, these valleys will flood with water. In fact, we were in Israel this past time, and down toward the Dead Sea, it was all over the news, a few teenagers had started hiking down one of those dried out riverbeds that led down to the Dead Sea. A flash storm came up, and that dry river filled up, and several teenagers lost their lives in a flash flood. But here in this valley of Elah, it's a valley about a mile wide, and it's got hills on both sides. And so what they would do when they set themselves in battle array is one army would be on one hill or mountain, the other army would be on the other hill, and this valley between them. Of course, each army wanted the other army to advance and attack them. So it's much easier to defend against your enemy when they're coming up to you on a mountain as in a downhill. So what happens in this chapter was not unusual as we meet the giant in a few minutes. Because as the armies would be on opposite hills with the valleys separating them, they would taunt each other. And they would yell and scream and try to put fear and intimidate the other side. Because if they could get the other side to respond in fear, half their battle was already won. So they would taunt each other, and this would go on for days and weeks, and the armies would just sit there on the mountains. Well, that's what's going on now. And in this valley, there's a brook in the middle. I've been to the valley of Elah, and it's the one place in Israel today where you can still go and get a bucket load full of small round stones. I was teasing somebody there when I was there the last time. Maybe the Israelis just bring dump trucks in and dump rocks in there because they know when the tourists come, they're going to pick up a rock out of the brook there. But just imagine two armies on two separate mountains, a valley about a mile wide, separating them. And that's what it says in verse 3, that the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with the valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Let's kind of put this in perspective. 6 cubits and a span. A cubit in Old Testament times was basically the distance between a man's elbow and the end of his finger. Roughly 18 inches or so. So if my math is right, and he's 6 cubits, that would equate to about 9.5 feet. A span. You know what a span is? When you stretch out your hand, the distance between your thumb and the end of your finger was a span. So we got a guy that's 6 cubits, 9.5 feet, span 6 to 9 inches. Let's say the man's 10 feet tall. I mean, in modern history, we have stories of men being 8 feet tall. The Guinness Book of World Records has some stories in there of men that are tall. And throughout history, there have been big men. My kids have watched, if they've watched it at one time, they've watched it about 300. The movie The Princess Bride with Andre the Giant in there. And I remember the days when Andre the Giant was a wrestler. And Andre the Giant would get in the wrestling ring, and people would come out and they'd be staring at about his belly button. Andre the Giant was a big man. But I can't imagine a man that's 10 feet tall. Too bad they didn't have pro basketball back then. Don't worry about dunk the ball, just drop it in the basket. But here's a guy, he's a champion. And he had a bronze helmet on his head. And he was armed with a coat of mail. You know what a coat of mail is? Maybe you've seen a picture of a soldier with this brass plate on that has kind of like a fish scale kind of thing. It was like a bronze coat that they would wear. Not unusual for a soldier. But what it tells us was that the weight of that coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. You know how much 5,000 shekels of bronze weighs? About 200 pounds. So this guy, this giant of a man, wears armor around him like a coat that weighs 200 pounds. It's hard for me to even imagine that. And this guy's a warrior. I mean, to him, the 200 pounds is no big deal. Now, I just want to make one distinction as we go through here, looking at at Goliath. There's 5 verses that describe him physically here. But when we talk about the champion Goliath, don't think of what I told you about Samson. Y'all probably have forgotten what I told you about Samson. Samson was probably a wimpy-looking guy, because nobody could figure out what gave Samson his great strength. If Samson was an Arnold Schwarzenegger of his day, then they wouldn't have questioned where he got his strength. Well, just the opposite is true with Goliath. He is a giant of a man. And he looks like a champion warrior. He's carrying around him a bronze coat of protection that weighs 200 pounds. I can't imagine going up and down a hill, taunting somebody wearing 200 pounds. We've been having Hannah and Johnny live with us for a number of months now. And I have forgotten, because it's been a long time since I've had a baby in a carrier. But my house is on a hill. And And sometimes, you park in different places, and I try to help Hannah out. I get worn out carrying Ellie Faith in a baby carrier to the car. And that may be, 30 pounds? I don't know how much it is. So 200 pounds. But that's not all. Verse 6 says, he had bronze armor on his legs. Now, the only thing I could think of with the bronze armor on his legs is I had 3 daughters who played soccer. And they could never play in a soccer game without having shin guards. Can you imagine having shin guards made out of bronze or brass? Now he's got a 200-pound coat on. And now he's got shin guards. I can't imagine how big those things. The guy's 10 feet tall. He must have had a couple of feet of metal on his legs, which probably wasn't too light either. And he had a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Like on the back where he could pull it out and use it as a weapon. Maybe you've seen, was it the movie Braveheart, where he reaches behind his back and grabs the weapon. So here's a mighty warrior. The staff of his spear, verse 7, was like a weaver's beam. Now you think of a spear today with a little broom handle shaft on it. Well, his was like a weaver's beam. And his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. You know how much 600 shekels weighs? 25 pounds. So he has a spear with a weaver's beam on it with a 25-pound iron head on the end of it. If you don't think that's a big feat, try putting a 25-pound turkey on the end of a broomstick. It ain't going to work. It ain't going to. So the shaft of the spear had to be an equivalent size to support that 25-pound iron shaft. I bet you've never found an arrowhead that big made out of iron. So you can imagine, carrying this thing, plus the weight of the metal, that this has got to be a pretty muscular guy. And just to kind of put this in perspective, some of you are sports fans, and maybe you've seen this on TV before. Have you ever seen these big, husky guys that get out there on a track and field event, and they have a little round ball, and they're going, you know how much a shot put weighs? 16 pounds. 16 pounds. And I watch these guys on track and field, why they throw a shot put. Well, I'm thinking this guy's carrying a spear. It's got a 25-pound iron head on it. And the shaft is like a weaver's beam. He's got bronze shin guards on. He's wearing a coat of brass that weighs 200 pounds. This has got to be somebody who has, I almost would say, superhuman strength. I mean, I think of the physicality it would take to even carry something like that. And he also had an armor bearer, a shield bearer that went before him. And he stood, verse 8, every day and cried out to the armies of Israel, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. They were thinking, why put the battle and people get killed? Let's just have 2 men fight, and whoever wins, we'll let that be the one that beats the man. Now, think about this with me for just a minute. Who in Israel stood head and shoulders above everybody else? So who was Israel's giant? Saul. But we've already read that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. I remember reading early on about Saul in our studies, that he was a fierce man of war and won tremendous victories against the enemy. But when the Spirit of the Lord left him, what did he have left? And so this guy, as I told you earlier, the armies would camp on each mountain. They would cry out to each other and try to intimidate their foes, either to make them give up or run away in fear, or when they did actually get them in battle and combat, they would be so terrified that they would be easy to whip. And can you imagine now this giant coming down the mountain into the valley of Elah there, shouting up to the Israelis on the other side, "I dare somebody to come down and fight me." In verse 8, it tells us that he was challenging them every day. And by the way, this went on for 40 days, that he would come down. And you can imagine that the tactics of warfare in that day, was to kind of sit and wait to see who was going to make the first move. And for 40 days, this giant, and I don't know, maybe Samson. I told y'all when we studied Samson, I kind of had a Richard Simmons picture in my mind, kind of a squeaky voice and scrawny build. Goliath, on the other hand, I think had this deep, booming voice that matched his physique, and every time he spoke, everybody would just begin to shake in their boots. Yes?
Just how thick is a weaver's beam?
We're not real sure, but a weaver has a pretty big tail, if you look at one today.
Oh. Okay.
Because they swim with their tail, don't they? Outside my little realm of expertise, so don't quote me on that one. I have to do some research. I'm not sure. All my studies, I didn't come across anything about how big a weaver's beam is. All I could find was that the shaft had to match or be able to hold the weight of the spear. And that's why I said try to carry a 25-pound turkey with a broomstick. Because it's not going to work. It's going to snap off you, and you couldn't throw it. So whatever a weaver's beam is, it'd have to be big enough to support a 25-pound piece of iron on the end of it. Yeah. Verse 9. Goliath is taunting the people of Israel. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we can fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Saul being at one time the great military leader of Israel, now shaking in his proverbial boots every time this man would walk down. So here's this going on now. And this giant, this champion, taunting the people, daring them to send someone out and fight him. Now David, verse 12, the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons, and this man Jesse was old and advanced in years in the days of Saul. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the oldest. The second born was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to keep his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So twice a day, this guy would lumber down into the valley, make his threats, and call out and dare somebody to come. And each day, I imagine they would be a little bit more afraid. I was trying to find a show to my wife tonight, but I couldn't find it. An article on Fox News today about a haunted house in Niagara Falls. And one of the prices of admission at this haunted house was that the company had the right to post your image on social media if you toured their haunted house. And so what followed in the article on Fox News today were a series of pictures of people who were extremely terrified, and the camera caught their expressions as they were going through this haunted house. And I wanted to grab a couple of those and show you tonight, but I couldn't find it again. And that's just at a haunted house in Niagara Falls. But when I saw that today, I said, what a picture of what was going on with Saul and the people of Israel when they saw this giant, not once, but twice a day, come out. And each day that he would come and defy them and dare them to fight, I imagine they got a little bit more fearful, because they probably thought it's only a matter of time. And we're cooked. So meanwhile, the scene switches to David. And David there is watching his father's sheep while this Philistine is presenting himself for 40 days and taunting Israel. And in verse 17, the thing that kind of sticks out of this is God always has a timing for everything. He's never late, he's never early, but God always is on time. And what prompted Jesse at the end of this 40 days of this giant taunting Israel to just come up with this idea that he wanted his youngest son to go check on the 3 older boys who were out there serving in the military. So God has a plan, and what it looks like, if you just were observing this from the outside, is that this is just a father concerned about his kids, and he wants to check on them, which is probably right. But the timing of it is so that when David goes, he's going to hear this giant. And so those days that this giant was taunting Israel, God was preparing David. Preparing him just by watching sheep. And just a little side note there, every person that God called, with maybe the exception of Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was called before he was born. He was called in his mother's womb. All the prophets of the Old Testament, the men that God used, and the women that God used, were busy doing something when God called them. You know, we want to sit back and, I'm just waiting for God to show me something. I'm just waiting for God to David was out there watching sheep, taking care of business at home. And in the process of that, God began to arrange the circumstances. There are no coincidences with God. Jesse said to his son David, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain, and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. It's about a 20-mile journey from where David was to the valley of Elah. And Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. They weren't really fighting at this point. They were just drawing up in battle lines. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words, and this time David heard them. So he's sent on a mission by his dad. He travels 20 miles. He gets there, ties the things up with the supplies, and goes out and finds his brothers just at the time The armies are there in array. Now, I don't know how you could, my sanctified imagination, maybe the armies lined up there. You got Israel on one side and the Philistines on the other. And they're standing there shouting, they're yelling at each other, come on, let's fight, let's fight. And all of a sudden, out of the back of the army, somebody stands up. And he begins to push his way to the front. And he comes out again and stands in front of the army and shouts his defiance to the people of Israel again. And David hears him this time. I don't think Goliath was standing out there in front of the army the whole time. I think he made his appearance. He just, from wherever he was at, maybe he was taking a little nap, I don't know. But he would just kind of push everybody aside, sort of like Andre the Giant did when the prince, Humperdinck, had sent to arrest and kill all the people in the town. And what does Andre the Giant do to the people as they're trying to get somewhere? They just kind of pushes them all out of the way. You can tell I've seen the movie a few times. And that's the way I imagine Goliath now. That the armies, they're shouting at each other and they're trying to intimidate each other. Come on, let's fight, let's fight. We're going to take you down. All of a sudden, the army begins to part like the Red Sea. And there stands Goliath. And he begins to shout in that deep voice of his. And the men of Israel, verse 24, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches and will give him his daughter, and cause his father's house to be exempt from paying taxes in Israel. And David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? The people, the men, called Goliath a man. David said, he's an uncircumcised Philistine. And they were looking at what the king was going to do for the one who could defeat Goliath. David was jealous for the honor of God. Who's this guy think he is? Defying the armies of the living God. Wasn't concerned so much about the reward that would be given. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with who did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. This is David's first battle here. I mean, he's come down and he hears this giant talking. And now he's got a brother who is poking fun at him. And sometimes when God calls us to do something, the resistance comes from right within our own family. And so David had to endure the onslaught of his brother. And I like David's response in verse 29. David says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Certainly the comments of Eliab hurt David, but they did not hinder David. Is there not a cause? The cause would be this man is defying the living God. So he turned around and began to speak to somebody else the same way. He sort of ignored, what his brother was saying to him, because that would have been a great discouragement to David at this point had he listened to his brother. Now the words which David spoke were heard, and they reported them to Saul, and Saul sent for him, verse 31. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." And so David's second battle now, if you look at this from his perspective, he had to battle the taunting of his family. And now he has to endure probably what was, at least on the surface, a reasonable statement. You're not able to do this. He's a warrior. You're not. You're just a kid. And it was probably good advice, but it was also another battle that David would have to face. So David said, and this is what I was telling you at the beginning, verses 34, 35, and 36. What prepared David for this moment? What prepared David? He said, "I'll kill this man. Who does he think he is, defying the armies of the living God?" And David said, I'll battle this Philistine. And where had David learned that? Well, verses 34, 35, and 36. David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's flocks, or sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." So David had been prepared in his pasturing time with the sheep, his alone time. And that's why I was thinking about this, what we do in our alone time. You think nobody sees, nobody notices, it's not important. It is extremely important with what we do in our alone time. That's where character is developed. That's where integrity and honesty are birthed. When we are free to do what we want to do, that we surrender willingly to the things of God in our private times, in our quiet times. We learn how to talk to God. We learn how to fellowship with the Lord. We learn how to take care of those things that are at hand. And as we do, God is preparing us for greater things. He who is faithful, Jesus said, in the little things will be faithful in the big things. And maybe you need to think about what goes on in your alone times. When you're alone and nobody's around, what is being developed and birthed in you in those times? I think of the movie that Kirk Cameron was in, Fireproof. And part of the conflict that he had with his wife was the things that he was doing on the computer when she wasn't there. And I wish I could say that's a problem isolated to a movie. That really isn't true. But folks, that is more true than I ever would like to admit, even among pastors, that we are being bombarded with pornographic, sexually explicit things. And many people now, in the secrecy and privacy of their homes, are going to places they have no business going. And we wonder why God is not doing anything. Or we have some time alone that God is saying, "Come away, have some time with me." And as we were hearing just a few minutes ago, the tendency is you get your phone out, and all of a sudden you're playing games, or you're doing stuff. And before you realize it, you've wasted away an hour that could have been spent in communing with the Lord. And we wonder why when the trials come, we have no strength for battle. We wonder why when the enemy rises up, that we are unable to stand and we cower with fear because something has not been occurring in our private time. I am convinced that worship, public corporate worship, should be nothing more than an overflow of what's been going on in mine and your personal devotions. But be that as it may, David says, look, I'm not concerned about this. I've been training for this time. I've been working on this out there when nobody was looking. So I killed both the lion and the bear. So this uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them. Moreover, David says, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Now David had also learned something else while he was busy watching the sheep. He had learned to trust the Lord. He had learned to depend on God to be his help and his strength. Now, I'm glad that our life is not one series of traumatic events after another. But traumatic events do come. You and I learn to trust God in the everyday routines of in and out daily living. Am I trusting God to meet my needs today? Am I developing relationship with him on Monday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday? Am I cultivating the inner man? Am I developing time with God? And y'all probably heard me say this more than you would like me to hear me say it, but I'm going to say it one more time. Everything that happens to us is another opportunity for us to learn to trust the Lord. In my quiet times, in my alone times, it's an opportunity for me to learn to trust the Lord. Silence is something we don't like. And I'm thinking about, I haven't made a decision on this yet, opening the church up during the day and just having some soft music playing. And people want to come and be alone with the Lord, to come and do that. But we need to develop that. So David here has been preparing for the day of battle, and he had learned to trust the Lord. He says, God's going to take care of this. And Saul says, okay, go ahead. Let the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor. And he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him also with a coat of mail. Now, down in verse 42, David is a youth. He's ruddy and good looking, and Saul was the guy that was head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel. So what do you think the armor of Saul looked like on David? It's way too big. And David, and it's another battle that David had to fight. He had to fight the family, discouraging him. He had to fight what Saul was telling him. You're not able to do this. There's always a naysayer in our life who says, you can't do that. You don't have resources to do it. You're not strong enough to do it. You haven't been to seminary. You haven't been to Bible college, they tell us as pastors. But now he has to fight another battle. And you can never fight your battle with somebody else's armor. You can never do it. Just because somebody else had a victory doesn't mean that that's the way God wants to give you the victory. It has to be your own. So he tried it, and he says, man, I can't even walk in these things. Verse 39. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put him in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistines. And again, I'm thinking in my sanctified imagination now, I got these armies at the bottom of each side of the hill. The brook is in the middle, right? The brook is in the middle. And the giant, Goliath, is on the other side of the brook. David is moving toward him before he even has the 5 stones. I mean, he is advancing toward the enemy, not even having his weapons yet. Now, we think of the story where he's right there by the brook, he just happens to pick up 5 stones, but he begins to move forward toward the enemy, and he picks up the stones on the way. Why did he pick up 5 stones? Well, Goliath had 4 brothers. I don't know if they were in the army or not, but I don't know. He picked up 5 stones. And the Philistine looked about and saw David. The word looked about in the Hebrew is a word that means he had to search to find. Like David was a little runny guy. He's trying to look around to find him. And when he saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So David was more interested in God's honor than he was his personal safety. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it. And it struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Same thing that happened to Dagon, the god of the Philistines. When they took the ark and brought it to Dagon's place, he was on his face. And here the Philistine giant falls on his face before David, or to the earth. So verse 50, David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone and struck the Philistine, but there was no sword in the hand of David. So therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now, again, maybe my imagination is too off, but Philistines just laying on the ground. You got armies on both sides watching. And here's David and the giant laying down on the ground. What do you think was going through their minds? This is a trap. He's going to let him get close, and he's going to do him in. And so David cut off his head and running around. That's what it says. He's going to run around holding the head of the giant up. And so when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sha'arim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. I was listening to Joe Foch on this, and he said maybe David would just kind of like to collect things. He had a lion's head, a bear's head, and now Goliath's head. Maybe you have taxidermists, getting those things. I said, that's pretty good. So now the chapter will end with Saul asking some questions, and Saul asked Abner to find out who David's father is. What is his family? He's not asking who David is. He's asking who his family is. Remember, he promised his daughter to be married to him. So he's asking about the family. And then Abner goes and gets David. And what does David do? He comes up to Saul with what in his hand? The head of Goliath. Maybe there's a sick side to David. I don't know. But here's what one man can do who's learned to trust the Lord. And God is for you and me teaching us every day to trust him. We don't know how the end of the chapter is going to be for you and me, bless you. We don't know how the end of the chapter is going to be, but as you and I are learning to trust God today, then tomorrow is going to be a day of great victory. But be faithful today. Don't despise the days of small beginnings. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that it's true. Help us every day to live, Father, learning